You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
I first learned about modafinil in 2012. It's a prescription drug that's commonly used to treat narcolepsy and a range of other issues, including sleep disorders and attention deficit hyperactive disorder. It's also used, off prescription, as a cognitive enhancer. And finally, I read a study that said jet fighter pilots could function for up to 37 hours of continuous wakefulness with a very small drop in baseline function if they had a 100 milligram dose of modafinil. In simple terms, that means they could stay up for a long time without the usual symptoms of sleep deprivation. So, guess what I did next? Hello, and welcome to another episode of Vishnu Ki Secret Life. I'm Vishnu Gopinath, and this is the show where I teach you something new about nutrition, fitness, life, or lifestyle choices, usually through my own, sometimes questionable decisions. Today, I'll tell you about smart drugs, what I learned from experimenting with them, so you don't make the same mistakes I did. I first read about modafinil when I was 15 or 16 years old, maybe. The article said that the author had taken it daily and had back to back days of productive work for weeks. And then I read about people who took it to work for long periods of time without sleeping or feeling exhausted. I never thought I would need it or try it, but it sounded interesting. So, my mother is a psychiatrist, so I asked her pretty straightforwardly if I could have some. Her response, in simple terms, was no, no way, you don't need that. You shouldn't have things that affect your brain chemistry. So, obviously, I listened to her and I never touched it, right? I tried modafinil for the first time in law school. I kept delaying a number of previous exams, and one thing led to another, and eventually I had just 2 weeks to write 9 exams because I refused to, or I just failed to take a few of them and I let them pile up. Trust me, if you had to do tax law, you would do the same thing. Long story short, I went to a medical store and I picked up a 100 milligram strip of modafinil. The strip had 10 of them, each of 100 milligrams. So before you ask me what it's called, don't. I'm not going to tell you its generic brand name or endorse its use. On to my experiment. The first day I had one in the morning, around 8 am, and I made myself a cup of black coffee and I sat down to study. I'd slept well the previous night, but I was a little distracted, as always. I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder when I was a child. So some time passes, and in, say, 45 minutes, I'm glued to my book. I think it was Civil Procedure Code, and I couldn't stop reading. I felt an extremely heightened sense of focus. Another thing I felt was a loss of appetite. I had zero hunger, none, zip, zilch. I didn't feel nausea or any kind of aversion to food. I just didn't want to eat. I was constantly thirsty. I'd drink a large glass of water, but no, that wouldn't be enough. 5 to 10 minutes later, I'd be thirsty again. In fact, this is something that even happens with coffee as well, but to a lesser extent. Back on topic. I was definitely thirstier, but the hunger was almost non existent. And excuse me if this is a little too much information, but I was also peeing a lot more than usual. So these were the first three side effects I discovered about modafinil. It reduced hunger, it increased thirst, and it made me pee all the time. On an interesting side note, these three things also happened to me when I eliminated simple carbohydrates from my diet and started eating a higher protein, higher fat diet, or when I had other stimulants like coffee. But those were only the side effects. Let's talk about how it helped. I was focused. I was ridiculously focused. While normal people feel their focus amplify on this drug, for a person who had attention deficit hyperactive disorder, it was like gold. Having an inability to focus while having an above average intelligence or IQ is awful because you know you're smart, but you just get so distracted so easily. The focus I felt on modafinil was alien to me. So by the end of the day, I was still quite focused, but I drank maybe 40% more water than I usually drink and eaten maybe just one large meal. And I gave my first exam the next day. And I think it went off fairly well. I think I scored a well above average grade. But I had another exam the next day, very little time to sleep, and a whole semester's worth of studying to catch up with in one day. So I slept for 3 hours, around 9 in the night, woke up, popped a modafinil, and started to study. Black coffee, some meat, and some of that dehydration. And a few hours later, I was in the zone, studying. My eyes were a little dry and I was a little bit dehydrated, but I was studying. Day 3. Now, 2 days into my exams, I was starting to feel the sleep deprivation. But I had one more exam coming the next day, and even if I wanted to sleep, I wouldn't be able to sleep immediately because of modafinil's half life. What's a half life, you ask? The half life of a drug is the time taken for the plasma concentration of the drug to reduce to half its original value. A half life is used to estimate how long it takes for a drug to be removed from your body. This meant that when I'd finish my exam and come home, I wouldn't be able to sleep immediately because there'd still be a lot of modafinil in my bloodstream. I'd be ridiculously tired, but I wouldn't be able to sleep because modafinil stays in your system for anywhere from 12 to 15 hours, and even more time if you consider the half life and all the other chemical properties and compounds of it. An inability to sleep meant I'd have to be sleep deprived for the next exam, and as a result, I'd have more modafinil. Day 4 and day 5. By the fourth day, I was only sleeping for 2 to 3 hours a day, but I was studying a semester's worth of a subject in a single day. I'd come back from my exam, I wouldn't study anything for some time, and I'd try to relax till I felt sleepy. And when I did feel sleepy, which was around 9 at night, I'd make sure the room was dark enough for good sleep. I can't say healthy sleep because clearly there was nothing healthy about this pattern. By the time I was asleep, it would be so late that if I overslept, I wouldn't be able to study. So I'd pop a modafinil right before I went to bed. After 5 days of sleep deprivation, I was starting to feel a disconnect from reality. I felt extremely sensitive to light and loud sounds, and don't even get me started on the sensations. Cold water felt like I was being drowned in ice, and hot water felt too hot. This pattern continued till my exams ended, and fortunately, I stopped having modafinil right after that. But skip forward a few months. I had a big interview with a top tier law firm. The night before the interview, I was a little worried, so I popped a modafinil. Biggest mistake of my life. I couldn't sleep all night. The whole night I was tossing and turning because that's what modafinil is meant to do. It's not supposed to allow you to sleep. I tried forcing myself to sleep and I couldn't. I had the most broken, erratic sleep ever, and I kept waking up. The next morning, I woke up looking like I'd spent the night getting punched in the face. No prizes for guessing how my interview went. I didn't clear it. I messed it up on something basic, a question that I could have looked up online in all of 20 seconds. So, while it can be useful and a little scary sometimes because of what it does have its share of negative side effects. These were some of the negative side effects I'd experienced. Hopefully, they should serve as reminders why you shouldn't take these so called smart drugs. The first negative side effect: an inability to multitask. I wouldn't be able to multitask without becoming overly obsessed with one thing. This was especially troubling when I worked a job that required heavy multitasking with tight deadlines. Negative effect number 2: anxiety. I am already a fairly anxious person. Modafinil only made this worse because when you're on it, you need to work. You need to be productive. You feel this compulsive need to do all those things. If you don't, you'll feel tense, irritable, anxious, and you will start berating and beating yourself up. I cannot overstate how bad the anxiety would get. This, combined with physical stressors, would make the anxiety worse, almost to a nearly unbearable point. One time, in the year after law school ended, I had a day where I hadn't eaten anything all day. I'd slept very little and I'd just quit smoking. I'd worked out a lot that day on a completely empty stomach and I'd had a modafinil. So on that day, I had a full blown panic attack. I was at my mum's house when my heart started beating extremely fast. I felt like I was about to collapse and like the world was going to end. I felt like I wanted to die. I couldn't breathe and I was panicking without understanding why. I collapsed and my mother had to give me anti anxiety medication to calm me down. There was no real reason to panic, which basically tells you that modafinil does tend to aggravate anxiety. Negative effect number 3, obsessive behavior. This is kind of an extension of negative effect number 1, an inability to multitask, because modafinil made me obsess. If I was writing, I'd write with too much attention to detail and I'd often get lost in my own work. I'd also keep trying to continuously optimize whatever I was doing to do it perfectly. While this sounds like a good thing, it can often lead to repetitive behaviors like doing the same thing and repetition and repetition and repetition and repetition over and over and over till you realize you spent maybe twice or thrice the time you would have normally spent on something because you were on modafinil. Negative effect number 4, zero patience. I was already an impatient person, but on modafinil, I would have very little patience for anything that I felt wasn't related to the work I had to do. Friends, family, small talk, music, all these things would be negated to the exclusion of doing what I set my mind to. If someone called me when I was on the drug, I'd be itching to get off the call with them as soon as possible so I could get back to doing what I was doing, even if the task I was doing was absolutely pointless and mindless. Negative effect number 5, physical symptoms. On modafinil, I definitely felt my heart rate go up, and the fact that I'd have modafinil often with black coffee just added to increasing my heart rate and making me more anxious. Also, there were the physical sensations that I had mentioned earlier. If I was sleep deprived and on modafinil for a few days, hot things would feel too hot and cold things would feel too cold. And the last negative effect that I had felt, lowered immunity. Maybe this was an effect of not sleeping, but I also fell sick more often if I took modafinil regularly for a few days. I definitely felt like I was falling sick more often. So, that said, while modafinil may have some short term benefits that help me, I'd never endorse that anyone else do what I did. Always consult a doctor because clearly I'm not a medical professional. And be responsible with your health because you literally only have yourself to blame if anything goes wrong. That's all we have for you on this edition of Vishnu Ki Secret Life. Join us again next time where I'll tell you about how I just ate fat for 2 weeks and lost 5 kilograms.